Okay, so how to team in 45 minutes. So the first thing I want to talk about and think about is the basic setup of how you're going to do this, how you're going to approach these 45-minute sessions or 50-minute sessions. And there's some key places to start. One is to get organized. And this may sound really simplistic, but I have found I actually have to be cognitively aware of this, like knowing where things are, to find the tools so that in a session I'm not like looking around for materials, knowing how I'm going to present this information to a client, and that kind of thing. So having some kind of organization, and then having a plan. So some structure, and I'll just ask people if you can stay muted. That would be great till we do Q&A. And having some kind of plan, some structure, like what am I going to accomplish? This does have to be pretty flexible, as we all know. It can shift gears when you're working with someone that like might present with anxiety, and you're going along talking about anxiety, and then all of a sudden it turns out there's maybe a habit problem that they haven't disclosed because they were embarrassed about it. And so then that has to be, be talked about and whatnot. So we want a structured plan that allows us some flexibility. Which is, of course, the third one, being flexible. And thing that can help us, I found, helped me quite a bit, was knowing some of the best places to stop. Like knowing, like if I stopped I'm trying to get an example of a bad stop. If I stopped in the middle of like externalization of voices, sometimes, or downward arrow, sometimes you just left them at like an emotional level that wasn't real comfortable. Now, sometimes that happens and you just have to deal with that. I know that happens, but knowing in my mind ahead of time where a good place to stop is, I found that helpful. And I have some list of those. And then we'll talk a little bit about, well, what about if I have a good place to stop and the next step is going to take a while to explain and dive into, then what do I do if I've got time left? So we'll talk a little bit about that. So the organization. So what I do with this is I have a team outline for every client. So I put it in the client notes, and I've shared that with you in the handout. Feel free to adjust that however you like. Different trainers do things in a little bit slightly different order. David calls it keys on a piano, can all make beautiful music. There's certain notes that can be a little discordant, but for the most part, you can make music in many different ways. So adjust the outline as you like. I've adjusted it multiple times, just even for myself and working with my clients. And I'll also tweak it for specific clients' treatment goals as well. So, if we're working on relationship stuff, I may add or change a little bit of the language even in that outline so that I know where to go next. And I use a little highlighter too. I do work in Word. If you're using a management system, then you might want to use a different way of tracking where you are next. One thing I have done in the past was start here or next. I would just have big capitals, next, right at the very bottom of the notes, so that when I came to the next week, I could just scroll down to the bottom of the notes, look for next, and then I would know where to start. I also track, of course, the BMS and the ETS, and I just use a chart. I chart. I use a table in Word, and then I can just see the scores fairly quickly. And of course, tracking the useful methods. So I keep a little summary in kind of near the bottom corner of their notes, but before homework, where I keep a summary of the tools that seem to be working for this client. And on my first page, I record any goals that they want to do and any goals that we have met. So again, you can organize however you like, but these are some things that you might want to think about when you're planning out your notes and how you lay them out. Yeah, so here's kind of the team outline. And again, there might be some nuances here that could be flushed out. When I started, and in the notes, I'll have a little more information than here. This is my shortened form. I would actually even put in samples, like sample things to say, because I would feel a little lost when I was first getting going. So I might say, ask this or ask that, or I'd have the wording and I would have it in quotes, what I would say to the client. So, empathy, which is going to go throughout all the stages, invitation, so on and so forth. But these are clear, distinct markers so that I know where I'm at in a session with a client. And then I just highlight wherever I left off in the last session. Yeah, this is just my little table that I use for BMS. And again, you could create some kind of other table. If you're doing an electronic management system, you could use a spreadsheet. But I use one Word document for one client, and all their notes go in that one Word document. So I'm not trying to look around for stuff. And so in that one Word document, I first put in this outline, and then I have goal setting, I think just under it or above it. I have what books they have all on that first page. So when I open their notes, I can look really quickly. Oh, this is the book they have. This is where we ended last. This was their treatment goal or their answer to the miracle cure. And then the second page is this BMS record. And then the following third page would be my current notes for that client. And I just copy and paste and keep shuffling. So, but let's look at the session outline. So the general outline of a session. So this 45-minute to 50-minute session you're going to have 3 to 5 minutes at the beginning where you're going to recap the BMS and the ETS. Probably 3 to 5 minutes where you'll recap homework. Then you'll do your session work, whatever that is for that period of time. And at the end, you're going to make sure you save yourself 3 to 5 minutes for homework setup, like how are you going to end the session, what homework are you going to assign this client, or you can get collaborative with them, and then booking the next session. So that's why they're 3 to 5 minutes. These are going to, like, I have some clients that just see me at a certain day, a certain time every week. So I don't need to spend as much time with those clients at the end of the session. Whereas I have some clients, they're like, they have to pull up their calendar and it takes some time to, like, we try this. No, that day's not going to work. Well, let's try this day. So it takes a little more time with some clients than others. And so I kind of know that after the intake, you get a bit of a flavor. So let's look at some good stopping points. So where might be some good stopping points when you're working with a client? Well, after the intake session. So you might choose to just, like, the first time you meet them, the first session is just the intake. Excuse me. And you may ask the miracle cure, you might ask, what would they like to work on, but you're not going to move through basically and go any further than just the intake. Another place, at any time really during empathy, you could stop. So, if you're still in the empathy phase, just carry on from the next week. I'll talk a little bit more about some tips about that when we get to there. You can stop just before or just after the moment in time, like when you get to that moment in time place. Anytime during or after positive reframing. Actually, during positive reframing is a great place to stop because you can assign the rest of positive reframing to them as homework. And if this was habit work, then I would say the triple paradox. If it were relationship work, the CBA of blame, the outcome resistance piece, right? You can typically do that anytime during that. Another good place to stop is after the magic dial. So I wouldn't this would be a good example of an awkward place to stop was like if you issued the magic dial, but then didn't do the goal column. Like if you didn't have enough time, if you looked at your clock, like, don't have time to actually go through the goal column, then I would hold off on issuing the magic dial, because when you come back the next week, they may have totally forgotten what you were talking about when you did the pivot question and the magic dial. And so that would take up extra time during that session for you to explain it and where you're at. Whereas once you've set the goals, when you come back the next week, you can recap that very quickly and launch into what thought would you like to work on first, right? And another place, a good place to stop is after process resistance. Again, you wouldn't want to stop kind of in the middle of process resistance, but right after the recovery circle and after any of the methods, right? So you've done a method, they've tried to come up with a positive thought. Maybe they've been successful, maybe they haven't, but after any method is a good stopping point. And for some methods, you'll find some will be easy to assign for homeworks and some won't. So I'll talk about that too. So what do you do if you have time left? So you've figured out, okay, these are good stopping points, but I still have like 5 minutes on the clock or 8 minutes on the clock. So there's a couple things that you can do. One is you could take a little extra time setting up the homework. So get them involved in setting up the homework, asking them how the homework is going, kind of use it as a little mini debrief time, check in how they're feeling with therapy so far, even if it's only the second or third session. Like, are there things they were expecting that's not happening? Are there, how is it matching their expectations? Just, kind of a conversation with them. You could also talk about what you're going to cover next week. Give them a dangle the carrot. You could be like, okay, well, just want to take a pause here and tell you next week, we're going to really talk about exposure. And I know you're kind of nervous about that because we talked about this during intake. Anyways, something like that. You could get them familiar with what they might be covering next week. You could also offer to add 5 or 10 minutes to the next session. I'm trying to slow down, calm down. You could also offer to add 5 or 10 minutes to the next session. I don't do this very often, but I have done it on occasion, generally more so with the longer sessions. Like, if I've got a 75-minute session and, they got 15 minutes left or something like that. Yeah, there's always that option. Okay, so let's take the first session. So the very first session, of course, we're in the testing phase, which we're testing every session. So the great thing about TEAM is it's linear and cyclical both, right? So we want to go through TEAM linearly, but then we also repeat it in a cyclic manner. We're never like, okay, check the box, we've done testing, we don't have to do any more testing, or, oh, we did empathy, got an A+, I don't have to be empathetic anymore, or we deal with resistance, I don't have to worry about any resistance ever again. These are still concepts that we continue to move through. But when we first start, we are going through this linear process. So testing, the intake session, you may use many different tools. There's the easy diagnostic survey, you have a general intake, you may do a suicide interview if those kind of thoughts come up during the process, or maybe other screenings that you use or your company uses. And so we're building connection this whole time using empathy and 5 secrets. Now, I used to do the intake like it was separate in my mind. I used to say, and you still could do this. These are 2 ways you could do this. One, you could just say, intake session is the intake session, and it's not really team related. It's just like, let's get through the information. Or you could treat the intake session as helping you build that therapeutic regard and getting empathy. I couldn't have done that the first few years I was doing this because it was too much, right? Like I'm still learning how to do an intake and it was too much. But now I'm combining the 2. So during intake, I'll ask them some questions, I'll do some empathy. And I think it feels so much better doing it that way. I'm finding more and more of my clients are giving me, the A+ or 20 to 20 in empathy, even during an intake session, which was not the case a couple of years ago. I would not have gotten those high scores at the beginning. So now I'm getting, usually right after the intake session, I'm getting either a 19 or 20. So that feels pretty good. And I feel like, okay, I'm honing those empathy skills every year. I'm trying to improve them. Miracle Cure, so that first session. So this may be session number 2, but I asked this during the intake as well. And because I want to start conceptualizing. And in fact, I've already asked this back in the 50-minute consultation. I tend to ask the Miracle Cure 3 times. And so because I want an idea of where I'm going with this client again, right? We're trying to have some structure, some plans to know which direction we're going, and that can be helpful. Now I know full well I might have to switch gears. New things may come up, but at least I'm kind of pointed in a direction. So yeah, that helps me with the goal setting treatment plan. And then I keep collaborating with the client at each of these stages on their priorities. So then session 2, and this might be 3, again, this is going to be a little bit flexible. again, it'll be more empathy, right? I'm going to spend time until I get that A plus in empathy, or A in empathy, somewhere in there. 19 to 20 on the BMS ETS. I do focus for 20, but I'm not so rigid that I don't move on if it's a 19. I will use that as a check-in with the client just to see where I'm at. And usually takes, 2 or 3 sessions, including the intake, to get that good empathy score, and to get the client feeling like they're aligned and ready to move forward. And so by the second and third session, I'm watching for places to issue the invitation where I wasn't ready to issue the invitation earlier. And so that's caught me off guard a couple times, but I mean, that's okay. But just, I have been like, okay, well, I'm just in empathy, and the client will be like, ready to go, and it's like we're not talking about anything anymore. They're just quiet, and I'm like, what did I do wrong? And I start wondering, why aren't they telling me their story? But it's because they're ready to get to work. And that happens with clients who've read David's materials, and they've done find a team CBT therapist in Google, and they've found me either through FGI or through David's website, or even just Google. So I'm a little more mindful now. If a client, I do ask, how much of David's materials have you read? And I know by intake, I'm asking, what books do you own of David's? And if they've got all of his books, then I know I'm probably going to be issuing that invitation, maybe even during intake session. So that's just one thing that I'm checking on the invitation at that stage. Oh, repeating loops. I was trying to figure out what I meant by repeating loops. Okay, so what can happen when we're doing these 45-minute sessions? It happens more often than if we were like in a 3-hour session. What can often happen is you've seen this client, they've done the intake, the next week they come and they tell you their story. They talked about how they're feeling worthless and inadequate, and it's like a failure. They haven't been getting good grades in school, and they're just struggling. And then the next week they come back and they're like, oh, their friends just asked them to come to a party, and they couldn't find the right dress to wear, and they just were so annoyed that they didn't have the funds that they needed because their parents were, not sharing the funds as quickly. And then you get the third week and they come back and they're like, oh, and they talk about something else, right? Some new stuff. But also you just end up empathizing with them, and you empathize with them, and you end up in this empathy loop where every week you seem to do empathy, and then there's need to be a place to put the invitation. So one of the ways I prevent this loop or moving on to new material, so it could be either one, is when I come back into the next session 2 or 3, I recap what we talked about the week before really quickly and briefly. And then I invite them to tell me more about that, rather than just open-ended, oh, what do you want to talk about today, right? So there's some structure here, even though it's empathy. Now, what I have found is if something really impactful happened that week, they will say to me, oh, I've got to tell you what happened this week. And then I let them go with that. I'm not going to squash that. I obviously want to, maybe they haven't really gotten to the issue they need to get to yet. They may not feel comfortable yet. So of course I'm going to run with that. But you'll find that if they need to tell you more often, they will. If you're a little bit concerned about it, you could say something like, last week you were telling me all about how hard it was in school and you're feeling a little worthless. And I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about what school's been like for you. Or was there something else that's come up that's really impacting you in this moment? I want to make sure we're heading in the right direction, because you had wanted to work on your feelings of worthlessness, but I also want to give you space in case there's something else that's coming up for you. So even in my inquiry, I'm now, repeating again, right? That I'd like to keep going in this direction with you, but hey, I'm sitting with open hands. And then when you get, okay, so you're at session 3 or 4 now, maybe even 5, we're looking now Now we're really watching for a place to do that invitation. And you can just insert it, even if you feel like, I don't know if I should do it or not. You can always ask it. Just ask and they'll let you know. You know, you just like, we've been talking for 3 weeks now about the various things going on in your life. And you kind of recap some of the things they said, like, you told me about school and how hard that's been. You've been feeling worthless. And then you had this conflict with your friends and that dress. And I'm wondering if now might be a good time to get to work on some of these feelings you've been having, or if there's more that you need to share with me. So it's just open-ended. That's that first layer of invitation. And then see where it goes from there. So you may offer that invitation several times before they say yes. It kind of depends on the client. I'll say several times. I don't personally. I think I usually am either 1 to 4. I don't think I've had to issue it more than 4 times, at least recently. Generally, I'm getting a better sense now of clients who just need to share first, or if they want to get to work. And then once you have that invitation, then we're going to get that moment in time with them. So either the daily mood log or the relationship journal, the habit log, one of those 3. And we're going to get in that moment in time. We're going to spend about 20, 30 minutes filling in the upsetting event, the emotions, negative thoughts, and so on. Before we move on to assessment of resistance. Now, if at this point the session is getting close to ending and they need to finish filling in the negative, let's say you get the emotions down and they got a couple negative thoughts, and you need to give them this as homework. A tip that I need to remember for myself, because I don't always remember this, is letting the client know all they need to fill in is is if they have any more negative thoughts. And I would even go so far as to say, don't worry about those positive reframe and distortions. We're going to come to that when we get back together. All I would like you to do for homework is to list your negative thoughts and how much you believe those negative thoughts. And we'll fill out the rest of this together when we get back. Because I've had clients think that the homework meant fill in the whole daily mood log, even when I've said just fill in the negative thoughts. So I like to say it kind of 2 times or even 3 times to make it really clear that all they need to fill in is the negative thoughts and how much they believe them. And then we'll move on to assessment of resistance. So I tend to find it takes 2 sessions or so to do assessment of resistance. It can take up to 4. I generally try to aim for the 2 because I have found if I go too long, clients start to feel like by now they've done 3 or 4 sessions of empathy, 3 or 4 sessions of assessment, and they're like, well, I'm not feeling helped, especially any of the clients who know a little bit about CBT, who know a little bit about team. They're kind of looking for that help, so to speak, quote unquote, right? They're looking for that, let's get to the methods portion. And for clients who don't know anything about it, who came thinking of talk therapy, this won't be as big of an issue. Something to be mindful of when you're doing your consult and your intake is to understand where your client is at. So for the outcome resistance, there's the 3 options. For mood work, it's positive reframe or a CBA. For habit work, procrastination work, it's triple paradox. And for relationship work, it's the blame CBA. There's several blame CBAs. You could use the blank one or the filled in one. There's several. So we're addressing that outcome resistance. And I tend to do this. I want to do this with the client because lots of times they're like, they only come with like 3, and then you can like give them a little nudge. Well, what about this? And have you ever thought about that? Or maybe I'm totally out to lunch right now, but I'm wondering about this. And then you can give them the rest as homework. And if you did finish it, then I ask them to read it over and add anything that comes to mind. Then the next session, when they come back, you can recap, ask them, did they add anything? And then kind of do a recap before you go into the pivot question, because now you have this document ready to go that has done all their outcome resistance. And at that point, whatever session you're at now, so with 4+, you can get into the process resistance, right? So we're you've asked them, have they added anything to their outcome resistance, to their positive reframe or their habit log, or excuse me, their triple paradox or CBA blame. and do that either the pivot question or paradoxical inquiry. If it's relationship or habit work, we use much more paradoxical approach. Although I tend to be paradoxical with my pivot question anyways, so that it's very similar for when I'm doing this. And then you can do voicing or externalization of the resistance if you like. That's a fairly new one. If you don't know what that is, when I get to the Q&A, let me know. And then I go into process resistance. Like, what are the things they're going to have to do to change? Although I've always done this in the consultation as well. So I tend to go pretty quick over process resistance at this point in my sessions, because I've generally really drilled this home during the consultation. It's all over my website. I tend to really like, okay, this is collaborative. You're gonna have a lot of work to do. You're gonna have homework to do. It's it's in all the paperwork and so on. But I do like to touch on it for sure, especially for anxiety, reminding them, hey, we're gonna, just a heads up, we'll be doing some exposure work and that kind of thing. And more so in habits and relationships, because I'm always asking willingness to change, or how willing are you to get close to this person? And then we move on to methods after we've addressed the process resistance, and in there you could do the recovery circle as well. So navigating methods. So one of the things that I do is and I mentioned this before, is I take notes of what methods are particularly helpful for that client, because generally they work more than once. And so if a client seems particularly like examine the evidence is really helpful, then when I look at my little summary real quick, I can try that one first, and that moves through the quick crushing the negative thoughts a little quicker. Or maybe they really like the double standard technique, or maybe they found semantic technique helpful. So I usually have like, ends up being about a list of 5 I found with most clients, 5 to 7 that seem to be like their go-tos. And then you're going to be mindful of how many methods am I going to be able to fit into the session. So let's imagine this is session 5, 6, whatever it is, and they've come back to you, they've worked on a negative thought, you're kind of finished all the assessment of resistance, and maybe even done identify the distortions, and you're thinking, okay, I got 45 minutes. I'm not going to sit there and go, okay, well, I think I could do 3 methods. I'm not that detailed, but I am going to check the clock after I finished each method. And I am going to ask myself, how long generally do I think this method is going to take? And will this method be one that's easy to assign for homework or not? So an example would be shades of gray. Shades of gray, you could actually describe it and then assign as homework. So even if you didn't get through it, even if you're in the middle of a method, if it's shades of gray, that's a fairly easy one to assign. Same with worst, best, average. It's got a worksheet. Explain the distortions is another one. There's the distortion crusher worksheet, or they explain the distortion worksheet. You can just give them the worksheet. So there's quite a few methods where it won't be too particularly important that you have to complete it. But there's some tools where it will lose its momentum if you can't finish it. So those would be the role play techniques, right? Externalization of voices, the double standard technique, feared fantasy. These role play techniques, you want to get to make sure you have some time for. So I would not start a role play technique at like 10 minutes to the end of a session. You may get through it in 10 minutes, but I want to have some buffer. So I tend to start role plays, near the very beginning. If it's a 45-minute session, especially, I would, kind of get into it first. What I will do is kind of set it up. So I might, we might be at the session, we've done identify the distortion, we've done explain the distortions, they've maybe done some semantic technique. And then I'm thinking, well, I think double standard might be good. So then I will actually tell them about, if I have time that session, I'll tell them about the double standard, and I'll make notes about it so that I know that's where I want to start next. And then when they come to the next week, I can tell them again how to do this technique, but it's not totally like, what are you asking me to do? Right? Like, because they've heard it before, even though they probably won't remember. They won't remember all what they're supposed to say or do. It will trigger, like they'll be like, they're kind of prepared, right? They're going to know, okay. And you will have worked through any of like, wow, role play, I'll feel silly. You can work through all that in the session before. Or maybe they won't do it at all. Some clients, I've had a couple clients just refuse. They hate role plays. That's fine. There's lots of other tools. Same with exposure tools, things like that. So oh yeah, interceptive exposure is another one. I definitely with interceptive exposure. I prep ahead of time because I want to make sure they have a straw, they have a mirror handy, all those things. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you can let me know, but that's one of the tools is interoceptive exposure. Jill teaches in her training. So yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about the mood methods. I usually start with identify and explain the distortions. I usually find this can be done in about one session for the first negative thought. I have found it takes about 2 or 3 sessions sometimes to crush the first negative thought. It seems like that one is always, and it doesn't matter which one they pick. They could pick the first one and just work their way down chronologically. They could pick the hardest one. They could pick the easiest one. It doesn't seem to matter what they pick. It will be tough, the first one. And that's because we're challenging their brain. We're trying to create those new neural pathways, right? And so, of course, it's going to take time, even if they know the material, because if it was easy, they would have just read the book and not even came to see you, right? And so it's going to be like this, like cognitive jarring for them, and it's a real challenge. The first thought. What I sometimes will actually say to clients, just to give them that hope and dangle the carrot a little bit, is, it's probably going to be a challenge to crush this first negative thought. Like it's probably going to take us maybe even 2 or 3 sessions. But don't let that scare you, because often once you've done that with the first one, the second one, probably half the time, third one, even faster. And 5, 6, and 7. Sometimes we can even do a role play technique called externalization of voices and crush kind of all the rest in a go. It kind of depends, but I just want you to be mindful that just because the first one's super hard doesn't mean that you're going to have to laboriously try and spend weeks trying to crush every single one of these thoughts. So I sometimes give them that carrot. Again, I mentioned this before, if the explain distortions doesn't work, then that's when I create the recovery circle and start moving on to other methods. Straightforward technique. Yeah, so sometimes I'll use this when a client is actually pretty easy at crushing their negative thoughts, like they can get 3 or 4 done. Then we might jump to it and just see if they can crush the thoughts. And if they can do straightforward technique for 3 or 4 thoughts in a row without needing a bunch of other tools, then you could just launch into externalization of voices and really rock it out of the park, because the client is able to start coming up with these. And I also start giving more and more homework at this point. So like I give more practical, specific homework to whatever we're working on. So at the beginning, first few sessions, I'm mostly giving them, read chapter, whatever, in whatever book we're in. But at this point, then I start getting, they get a reading and they start getting a, well, okay, I want you to work on this negative thought and finish identifying the distortions, or do this technique. Or sometimes I'll even say, all right, you're reading chapter, I think it's, I don't know if it's 12, I'm trying to think but they might be in the cognitive section in the when panic attacks, or maybe they're in feeling great. That way, that's feeling great. Then I'll say, okay, during your reading, I want you to think about your negative thought as you're reading these tools, and try and apply some of the ones that you're reading about. Relationship methods. So I got this from Mike Christensen, and what I do is during the consultation, if they decide they want to do relationship work, or even if they're not 100% sure, but they think it might be relationship work or it might be mood work, I actually get them to read the entire Feeling Good book before we meet. At least by the time we meet the second session, like if we're doing an intake, but I try to get them to read it even before intake. That has been, I'm so glad I got that idea from Mike. I was resistant to asking it because it felt like so much to ask of a client, that I was resistant to doing it. But now that I'm doing it, it has worked really well. Yeah, because I think sitting down and reading that whole book, there's something about that book, particularly in working with relationships, where I think they need to process and internalize everything that's going on. Yeah, so anyways, I do get them to read that one ahead of time. And then I focus more on the 5 secrets work with those clients, and forced empathy and those kind of tools. So, the first step 1 and 2, that's going to take the first couple sessions. They're going to fill in, what he said, what she said, or she said and he said, and then do lots of empathy. You can do lots of agenda setting, willingness, how willing are you to be the one that does all the soul work, even though that's pretty unfair for me to ask of you. So I'm asking that question quite a bit. CBA blame. I have a relationship worksheet that I do with clients. And then once I get to method, I'll spend more time on step 3 and 4 and 5, where they're revising their response. And then, so I will often give them as homework, one secret, like practice disarming technique this week, things like that. So with relationships and habits, I will say you can have sort of a basic recovery circle prepared, because there's not as many options and variety. So with the mood work, we're going to base our choices of methods on what distortions they're having. And most of the time I can find 6, if not all of the distortions in every negative thought. So I know pretty well I can fit most methods in, but so there's going to be some anxiety methods I'm going to go towards, or depression. There might be some extra ones, but it's still, there's a lot more choice. But with relationships and habits, I find I tend to go through the same kind of tools. And so you could have that kind of outlined for yourself, prepared. In fact, I was working on a recovery circle for habit, one for habits and addictions, one for procrastination. But I didn't get it finished before today's was going to be a little extra bonus. But maybe I'll do it for the homework workshop that I'm going to be doing in 2 weeks. So there'll be, this one's a little more linear, I guess. Is that the right word? You're not going to be going back over the same tools over and over like you would with mood work. Like every time we come to a negative thought, we will go back and do explain the distortions. With habits, we're kind of really dealing with motivational tools. So lots of motivational tools here. Just kind of work through that habits chapter that David has free on his website, which I just direct my clients to and say, you can go get this chapter free. Just go to feelinggood.com, scroll to the bottom of the page, enter your email address. And if you don't get it, please email me. And then I get them to start working through those worksheets. And then I reinforce the devil's advocate. Once sort of like the externalization of voices is your like bookend for mood work, devil's advocate is the one for habits.